My name is Naomi Castellano. I'm 44 years old, and for the last 19 years, I've worked as a claims investigator for a life and disability insurance company in Ohio. Today, I'm going to tell you how I discovered that my husband had been secretly preparing to leave our marriage for 3 years. What began with a strange banking notification led me to a hidden account, a secret LLC, and a betrayal I never saw coming. Stay with me and listen to this story until the very end, because what I learned about trust, boundaries, and protecting yourself may change the way you see your own relationships. Listen to the whole story. You'll learn something from what happened to me that I wish I had understood years earlier. Let's figure out what the story is. The lawyer slid the folder across the table and said the words so gently that it took me a full 3 seconds to understand he was talking about my own house. He filed the transfer 11 months ago, the lawyer said. The LLC has owned the deed since March. I remember looking down at my hands instead of the paper. I remember noticing that my wedding ring had left a pale groove in my finger, a little trench where 16 years of skin had simply given up and grown around the metal instead of under it. I remember thinking, with the strange, clinical calm that has gotten me through every disaster in my professional life, that a groove like that doesn't disappear. Even after you take the ring off, the body remembers the shape of what used to be there. I didn't cry in that office. I want to tell you that up front because I think you're going to expect me to, and I think by the end of this you'll understand why I didn't. I sat very still, the way I sit when I'm reviewing a claims file that's about to blow up someone's life, and I asked the only question that mattered. When did he decide this? The lawyer, a careful woman named Patricia Urania who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet financial disappearing act, looked at me for a long moment before she answered. Based on the paper trail, she said, I guess about 3 years ago. 3 years. Daniel and I had been married for 16. We had been, by any outside measure, fine for most of them, not electric, not the kind of couple who still held hands in restaurants, but fine, functional, a working machine of 2 people who had built a life and a mortgage and a teenage daughter and a set of habits, so worn in they felt like bedrock. I had thought we were tired. I had thought we were simply 2 adults who loved each other in a quieter register than we used to, the way a fire banks down to coals and still keeps a house warm. I did not know that for 3 of those 16 years, my husband had been quietly building an exit. I promise you, we will get to how I found out. We will get to the filing cabinet and the account in Delaware and the conversation with his mother that I still hear in my sleep, and the trip to the lake house that he called a fresh start and that I now understand was something closer to a closing statement. We will get to all of it. But if you've ever been the person in a marriage who kept showing up, kept doing the dishes and paying the bills and asking, how was your day long after the answers had gone flat and automatic? If you've ever suspected that the distance between you and someone you love had a shape you couldn't quite see, then I think you already know that the ending isn't really the point. The point is how a person disappears from their own marriage a little at a time, so slowly that even the person doing it can convince themselves it isn't happening. And how, if you're the one left standing in the empty room, you eventually have to ask yourself the hardest question there is. How long was I the only one still trying? Let me explain how we got here. My name is Naomi Castellano. Castellano now, though I was Naomi Reyes before I married Daniel Castellano, and, for reasons that will become relevant later, changed almost everything about my name and nothing about the version of myself that came with it. I am 44 years old. I have spent the last 19 years as a claims investigator for a mid-sized life and disability insurer, which is a polite way of saying that my job is to find out when people are lying. Most people, when they hear insurance investigator, picture something dramatic: stakeouts, surveillance vans, men in sunglasses photographing someone who claimed a back injury while they mow their lawn. There's some of that, sure. But the actual work, the work that made me good at my job, is quieter than that. It's pattern recognition. It's reading 3 years of someone's bank statements and noticing that 4 days before every claimed accident, there's a cash withdrawal in a round number. It's noticing that a signature that's supposed to be from 2019 is written with a pen that wasn't manufactured until 2021. It's noticing the sentence in an incident report that's a little too clean, a little too rehearsed, sitting next to 3 sentences that are appropriately messy and human. I've spent 19 years being paid to notice what people don't want me to notice. And I want you to sit with that irony for a moment, because it's going to matter a great deal by the end of the story. I built an entire career on my ability to detect deception in strangers, and for 3 years, I could not see it happening in my own kitchen. I think that's actually not a contradiction. I think it might be the whole point. You don't investigate the people you love. You extend them the one courtesy you'd never extend a claimant, the assumption of good faith. I gave Daniel that assumption every single day for 16 years, and it turns out that assumption was the exact blind spot he was living inside. I met Daniel when I was 26 at a continuing education seminar of all places, both of us bored out of our minds in a beige conference room learning about updated federal disclosure requirements. He made a joke, quiet and dry, about the speaker's use of the phrase going forward. He counted 14 instances in 40 minutes, and I laughed before I could stop myself, and he turned around and looked genuinely delighted that someone had heard him. That was Daniel at 29. Funny in a way that required you to be paying attention, private in a way that read as depth rather than distance. He worked in commercial real estate finance, structuring deals for shopping centers and office parks. A job that involved enough spreadsheets that we used to joke we were the most boring, exciting couple in Ohio. We got married 2 years later in his mother's backyard in Westerville, under a maple tree that's probably still there. His mother, Carol, gave a toast that I now recognize, with the clarity of hindsight, as the first data point in a pattern I wouldn't understand for another 18 years. She said, raising her glass, "Daniel has always known how to protect what's his." Everyone laughed. It sounded like a compliment about loyalty. I didn't ask myself, not once in that whole warm evening, what exactly he was protecting it from. We had our daughter, Iris, for years into the marriage. Those were, I think, genuinely the good years, sleepless and broke and stupid with love for this small, loud person we'd made, the two of us operating as a real team, trading off feedings and diapers, and 2 a.m. panic about fevers with an ease that felt like proof we'd built something solid. I don't want you to think this is a story about a marriage that was hollow from the start. It wasn't. Whatever came later, I need you to understand that what came first was real. The distance, when it started, didn't announce itself. That's the thing nobody tells you about emotional disconnection. It doesn't arrive as an event. There's no scene, no slammed door, no discovered lipstick on a collar. It arrives as a series of absences so small that naming any one of them out loud would make you sound insane. It was Daniel starting to answer, fine, instead of telling me the actual story of his day. It was me noticing and then not noticing anymore because I'd gotten used to it, that he'd stopped asking me questions that required more than a yes or no answer. It was both of us, without ever discussing it, migrating our real conversations to other people, me to my sister, him to some version of himself I apparently wasn't invited into anymore. It was two people getting extremely good at running a household together and extremely bad at knowing each other. I used to lie in bed at night, back in year 11 or 12, and do this thing where I'd try to remember the last time Daniel had told me something that scared him. Not annoyed him, scared him. A real fear, a real hope, a real doubt about himself. I couldn't. I could remember him telling me about deal terms and Iris's math grades, and whether we should refinish the deck. I could not remember the last time he'd shown me something underneath that. I told myself this was just what marriage became after enough years. I told myself everyone's spouse turned into a roommate eventually, that the passionate version of a relationship was a phase you graduated out of like a fever breaking, and what replaced it, routine, competence, low-grade familiarity, was simply the adult version of love. I believed, and this is the belief I want you to hold on to, because it's the one that explains everything that follows. I believed that as long as I kept showing up, kept doing my half, and more than my half, the connection would eventually come back on its own, the way a pilot light relights itself if you just leave the gas on long enough. I thought stability was the same thing as safety. I did not yet understand that a person can be extremely stable and be quietly building an exit at the same time. Those two things are not opposites. That was the mistake that cost me 3 years of my life, and it very nearly cost me a great deal more than that. If you've ever been the responsible one in a relationship, the one who remembers the anniversary and the dentist appointments and knows where the extra key is, I think you already know how easily that role can become a kind of invisibility. You get so good at holding things together that no one, including you, stops to check whether you're being held. Here is where the pattern actually began to change shape, though I didn't recognize it as a pattern at the time. I only recognized it as a series of individually reasonable requests. It started with Daniel's mother, Carol, who had been a difficult but manageable presence in our marriage for years. The kind of mother-in-law who commented on the seasoning in your cooking and rearranged your kitchen cabinets when she visited, but who I'd made an uneasy peace with because Daniel loved her and I loved him. About 4 years ago, Carol's husband, Daniel's stepfather, had a stroke, and the family responsibility, as families do, redistributed itself onto whoever had the most flexible schedule and the least willingness to say no. That turned out to be me. It made sense at first. I drove Carol to appointments because Daniel had client calls. I sat with her in waiting rooms because Daniel was the one who understood the insurance paperwork less, which, given my actual job, was true, but which also meant that within about 6 months, I had become the default family liaison for a woman who had never particularly liked me. I didn't mind, not really, not at first. It felt like being useful. It felt, if I'm honest with myself now, like a way of proving something, that I belonged in this family, that I'd earned my place at that maple tree. Then it was Daniel's younger brother, Marcus, who needed to borrow $8,000 for a business that never quite launched, money that came out of our joint account with a conversation that took less than 10 minutes and that I agreed to because Daniel asked me to trust him and because $8,000 against our combined income felt survivable. Then it was $11,000 more, 18 months later, framed as a bridge loan rather than a request, framed in a way that made it feel almost rude to ask for a timeline on repayment. Then it was smaller things that accumulated the way small things do. Daniel taking on more of Carol's medical decisions without mentioning it to me until after the fact. Family gatherings where financial conversations happened in a kind of shorthand I wasn't included in. Glances exchanged between Daniel and Carol that closed like a door when I walked into the room. I noticed these things. I filed them away the way you file away a coworker's odd comment. Not nothing, but not yet a pattern either. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters for you to understand it the way I eventually had to understand it myself. None of these individual moments was proof of anything. Helping a struggling brother is not a red flag. Caring for a sick stepfather is not a red flag. A private conversation with your own mother is not, on its own, a betrayal. What I didn't understand yet, what took me years and, eventually, a locked filing cabinet to understand, is that a pattern isn't made of red flags. A pattern is made of 100 small, individually defensible decisions that all happen to point in the exact same direction. And the direction ours were pointing, I would eventually learn, was away from me. But I didn't know that yet. What I knew, in year 14 of our marriage, was that I had become extremely good at managing everyone else's crises and extremely unpracticed at noticing my own. The first real crack, the first moment I let myself consciously wonder whether something was wrong, rather than just feeling a low hum of unease I refused to examine, happened on an ordinary Tuesday about 2 years ago, when I picked up Daniel's phone by accident instead of my own off the kitchen counter and saw a banking notification flash across the lock screen. I want to be precise about what I actually saw because precision has always been the thing that saves me. I did not see a balance. I did not see an account name I recognized. I saw a single line, a preview of a text alert that said, "Transfer confirmed, Meridian Point Holdings." I had never heard of Meridian Point Holdings. I set the phone down, told myself it was probably one of Daniel's work deals, something to do with the shopping centers and office parks he spent his days financing, and went back to making dinner. That's the moment I go back to most, when I replay all of this in my head. Not the office with the lawyer. Not the filing cabinet. That kitchen, that Tuesday, the version of me who saw something genuinely strange and chose, in under 4 seconds, to explain it away. I was so well trained in extending Daniel good faith that I did it automatically, the way you catch a falling glass before you've even registered it slipping. I didn't think about Meridian Point Holdings again for almost a year. What I thought about instead, over the following months, was Iris, who was 16 by then, and who, teenagers notice everything whether or not they say anything about it, started asking me questions that I didn't have good answers for. "Do you and Dad ever actually talk anymore?" she asked me once, out of nowhere, while I was driving her home from soccer practice. I remember laughing it off, saying something about how grown-ups' relationships look different than teenagers imagine, and she went quiet in the way she did when she decided an adult wasn't being straight with her. She was right not to believe me. I wasn't being straight with her because I wasn't being straight with myself. If you've ever tried to reassure a kid about something you privately suspected was true, you know exactly the particular flavor of guilt that comes with it. It was around the same period that Daniel started what I can only describe in retrospect as a campaign of low-grade withdrawal disguised as busyness. He started staying late at the office. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have set off alarm bells in a Lifetime movie, but by 45 minutes, an hour, a pattern of small extensions that added up to something. He started taking phone calls in the garage instead of the kitchen. He started referring to some things I'm working through with the business, vague enough that asking for detail felt like an overreach, specific enough to explain his distraction. I asked, of course I asked. I am not a passive person. Whatever else is true about me, I did not simply let this happen without trying to intervene. I asked him, more than once, if something was wrong, if we were okay, if there was something he needed to talk about. He always had an answer, and the answer was always some version of, I'm just tired, or work's been a lot. Answers that were plausible enough, delivered with enough weary sincerity, that pushing past them would have required an aggressiveness that didn't feel like it belonged in a marriage. I believed because I wanted to believe, and because 16 years of good faith doesn't evaporate just because a part of you has started keeping score. I suggested counseling 18 months ago now on a Sunday morning after a fight about something so small whose turn it was to call the plumber that its size should have told me the fight was never really about the plumber. Daniel agreed to counseling almost too readily, which I registered at the time as a good sign, and which I now understand, looking back, was something closer to a man clearing a scheduling obstacle. We went to 4 sessions. In the 4th one, our therapist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Ferris, said something that I wrote down afterward on a sticky note I still have. It's hard to reconnect with someone who's already made a decision they haven't told you about. I didn't understand, at the time, how literally true that sentence was. We stopped going to therapy not long after that. Daniel's schedule, he said, had gotten unmanageable. A business trip to Charlotte that turned into 2, a crunch period that never seemed to end. I let it go. Here is the belief I told you I'd name, the one sitting underneath every choice I made for those 3 years. I thought if I kept showing up, if I kept the house running and the calendar organized and my temper even, if I never once made him feel like loving me was a burden, the connection between us would come back on its own. I thought love that had gone quiet was still love, still there, just resting. I did not understand that quiet can also be the sound of someone slowly, carefully packing up and walking out the back door while leaving all the furniture in place so you won't notice the house is emptying. The moment the story stops being about a marriage growing apart and starts being about something else entirely, happened 11 months ago, on a Thursday, when I was looking for our home insurance policy in the downstairs filing cabinet, the one Daniel used for his business paperwork. The one that had a lock on it that I genuinely never questioned in 16 years of marriage, because why would you question a lock on your own husband's filing cabinet, in your own house, when you trust him? The lock was old, the kind you could open with a butter knife if you were patient, and I want to tell you I hesitated before I did it, because that's the version of this story where I come across better. The truth is I didn't hesitate for more than a second. I had a specific, boring reason to be in that cabinet, a policy renewal date I needed for a claim of my own, an ice dam that had damaged our roof, and when the drawer stuck instead of opening, I didn't think, I am about to discover something. I thought, this lock is annoying, and got a butter knife from the kitchen. Inside, under a stack of ordinary business files, deal memos, closing statements, the unremarkable paper skeleton of Daniel's job, there was a manila folder, unlabeled, thicker than the others. And inside that folder was the first real piece of evidence in a case I didn't yet know I was building. It was a formation document for a limited liability company called Meridian Point Holdings LLC, filed in Delaware 14 months earlier. Daniel was listed as the sole managing member. Attached to it, paper clipped in a neat stack the way Daniel clipped everything, because he was a tidy, methodical man, were bank statements for an account I had never seen in the name of that LLC, showing a balance that made my hands go cold. $211,000. I want you to understand what that number meant, sitting on our combined finances at the time. We had, in our joint accounts, about $40,000 in savings, which we'd talked about often, which we'd budgeted around, which had felt, in every conversation we'd ever had about money, like the actual ceiling of what we had. $211,000 did not exist anywhere in the financial life I understood myself to be living. And it had been building, according to the deposit history in that statement, in increments, 4,000 here, 6,000 there, a larger transfer of 19,000 about 8 months back for close to 3 years. I sat down on the floor of that office. I remember the carpet, a low industrial gray we'd picked out together when we redid that room, and I remember thinking with a strange, floating detachment that I had reviewed hundreds of fraud files that looked exactly like this. If a claimant had shown me this pattern, a private entity, formed quietly, funded through irregular transfers routed away from a shared account, held under a name their spouse had never heard, I would have flagged it within 30 seconds as a structured concealment of assets. I had built a career on recognizing exactly this shape. And I had been living inside it for 3 years without seeing it because I never thought to point my professional eye at my own husband. There's a moment when you find something like this, where your mind tries very hard to build you an exit. I sat on that gray carpet, and I built myself 3 different innocent explanations in about 4 minutes. Maybe it was for taxes. Maybe it was a business partner's money, held in trust, nothing to do with our marriage at all. Maybe, and this was the one I wanted most, the one I turned over in my hands like a smooth stone, maybe it was a surprise. Maybe Daniel, quiet, private, undemonstrative Daniel, had been secretly saving toward something for us. An anniversary, a dream house, some grand, silent gesture that would eventually explain the silence itself. I held on to that last explanation for 3 months. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important I didn't confront him immediately. I told myself I needed more information before I said anything, which was true, but which was also, if I'm being fair to myself now, fear. I was afraid that if I said the words out loud, I would collapse a version of my marriage I still needed to believe in a little longer. So, I did what I do professionally. I built a file. Over the following weeks, working in the evenings after Daniel had gone to bed, I started documenting. I photographed every page in that folder and put the originals back exactly as I'd found them, down to the order of the paper clips, because 16 years of marriage had at least taught me the precise geometry of Daniel's tidiness, and I knew that if a single sheet was out of sequence, he might notice. I pulled our joint bank statements going back for years and cross-referenced the dates of unexplained business expense withdrawals, always described in our shared budget spreadsheet in vague, plausible language, client dinner, conference travel, equipment, against the deposit dates into the Meridian account. 11 of them matched, almost to the day. Money that I had believed was funding Daniel's job had, in fact, been funding his exit from our marriage. I found something else in those weeks, something smaller but somehow worse, in the way small things sometimes are. Buried in an old email thread I found on our shared family laptop, Daniel had used it once, months earlier, to print a boarding pass and forgotten to log out. There was a message from Carol, his mother, dated over 2 years back. The subject line was blank. The body of the email was 4 sentences long. It said, "Talk to my lawyer friend about what you asked. You can hold assets separately even while married as long as you're careful about commingling. Just don't put her name on anything new. Love you. Be smart. Be smart." I read that sentence maybe 30 times. I thought about the toast Carol had given at our wedding 17 years earlier, under that maple tree. Daniel has always known how to protect what's his, and I understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives too late, that I had never once been included in the category of things Daniel was protecting. I had been, from at least the moment of that email, something he was protecting his things from. If you've ever discovered that a person you trusted had a whole second conversation happening about your life, one you weren't invited into, you know that specific kind of vertigo. It isn't just betrayal. It's the retroactive rewriting of every ordinary day you thought you understood. I didn't confront Daniel yet. I want to explain why, because I think it's the part of this story people misunderstand most. I wasn't being weak, and I wasn't being naive. I was doing what 19 years in my field had trained me to do, which is never move on a claim until you have enough documentation that the other side can't simply talk their way out of it. I had watched too many confrontations go badly for the person holding the truth, simply because they moved too early, with too little proof, and gave the other party time to construct a story faster than the facts could be laid out. I was not going to let that happen to me in my own kitchen. So I kept building the file. And about 7 weeks into that quiet, careful documentation, I found the piece that changed the shape of everything: a retainer agreement, also filed in that cabinet, with a family law attorney in Columbus, not Patricia Urania, a different firm entirely, dated 8 months earlier. The retainer letter referenced, in that flat, bloodless legal language that manages to be more chilling than anything dramatic could be, preliminary asset protection strategy in anticipation of potential marital dissolution. Daniel had hired a divorce attorney 8 months before that Thursday and had never said a single word to me. Not about wanting out. Not about being unhappy enough to consider it. Not even. And this is the detail that still catches in my throat when I tell the story. A version of honesty as basic as, I don't know if I want to keep doing this. He had made the decision quietly and had spent 8 months building the financial and legal architecture to leave the marriage on his own terms, while I spent those same 8 months driving his mother to physical therapy and believing that our silence was just something married people grew into. I want to pause here and tell you what this discovery did not do, because I think that matters. It did not make me scream. It did not send me into his office to throw the folder at him, though God knows I understand why some people would have. What it did was something quieter and, I think, more dangerous to the story Daniel had apparently built for himself. It turned me, fully and completely, into an investigator in my own life. The wife who had spent 3 years assuming good faith stopped existing in that gray-carpeted office, and the version of me that had built her whole career on refusing to look away from evidence took her place. Here is where the story could have gone one of two ways, and I want to be honest that I considered both. I could have confronted Daniel immediately, emotionally, the way 16 years of accumulated hurt might reasonably demand. Or I could do what I actually did, which was slower, colder, and I think, ultimately, the only choice that protected me. I hired Patricia Urania. I found her the way you find anyone you need discreetly, a referral from a colleague at work who'd gone through her own quiet divorce years earlier, a woman who understood exactly what it meant to need a lawyer before your spouse knew you needed one. My first meeting with Patricia, I brought the photographs I'd taken of the folder, the bank statement cross-references, the printed copy of Carol's email, the retainer letter. I laid it all out on her conference table the way I'd laid out 100 fraud files for 100 meetings with underwriters, methodical, dated, indexed. Patricia looked through it for a long time without saying anything. Then she looked up at me and said, "You do this for a living, don't you?" It wasn't really a question. "Insurance claims," I told her. "I find the thing people are hoping nobody notices." She nodded slowly. "Well," she said, "you noticed." Over the following 2 months, working with Patricia, I learned the true shape of what Daniel had built. The Meridian Point account had grown to $234,000 by then. He had, roughly 18 months earlier, also quietly transferred his half-interest in a small rental property we co-owned, a duplex we'd bought together in year 6 of our marriage as an investment, into that same LLC, using a mechanism called a quitclaim deed that I had, apparently unknowingly signed as part of a stack of refinancing paperwork. Daniel had asked me to sign on a Sunday afternoon almost 2 years before, paperwork he told me was routine, paperwork I had trusted him enough not to read line by line, because who reads every line of paperwork from their own husband? That detail, more than any other, is the one that still makes my hands shake a little when I say it out loud. I had, without knowing it, signed away my own claim to an asset because I extended the person I loved the exact trust that my entire professional life had trained me never to extend to a stranger. I want to say that clearly because I think it's the truest sentence in this whole story. The deception didn't work because I was foolish. It worked because I loved him, and love is the one condition under which even a trained investigator will stop investigating. Patricia explained that under state law, assets acquired during a marriage are generally considered marital property regardless of whose name is on them, and that a court would very likely see through the LLC structure. That commingling language from Carol's email had actually been prophetic because Daniel's own carelessness, small deposits from our joint account, a single client dinner paid from the Meridian account by mistake, had left exactly the kind of paper trail that could unwind the whole arrangement. But she was also honest with me about what it would take. Months of litigation, forensic accounting, a fight that would be expensive and exhausting and would very likely make the next year of my life miserable in ways I hadn't yet imagined. "You have two decisions to make," Patricia told me, near the end of that second meeting. "The first is what you're going to do about the money. The second, and it's a separate decision, is what you're going to do about the marriage." A lot of people think those have to happen at the same time. They don't. I left her office that day and drove home instead of to work, called in sick for the first time in 4 years, and sat in my car in our driveway for 40 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I want to tell you now about the first boundary because it's the part of this story where everything the family believed about me started to invert, and I think it's important you understand exactly how it happened, because it happened over something that, on its face, looked almost absurdly small. It was a Sunday, about 3 weeks after that meeting with Patricia. Carol called. She called often, by then, since her husband's recovery had plateaued into a long-term care situation that required near-constant coordination, and asked, in the breezy, assuming tone she'd used with me for years, whether I could take a week off work to stay with her husband while she went to visit her sister in Florida. It was, by any reasonable measure, an enormous ask, a full week, unpaid leave I hadn't planned for, care duties that went beyond anything I'd agreed to before. For 16 years, I would have found a way to say yes. That Sunday, I said no. I said it calmly, without explanation beyond, "I can't take that much time away from work right now." Which was true, though it was not the whole truth. Carol's response told me everything I needed to know about what my yes had actually meant to this family for the past 4 years. She didn't ask why. She didn't offer to find another solution. She said, in a voice gone suddenly cold, "I see. Well, I suppose we all know where we stand then," and hung up. Within an hour, Daniel came into the kitchen, where I was making dinner, with an expression I hadn't seen on him in years. Not the flat, distant look he'd worn for months, but something sharper, almost affronted. "My mother called me upset," he said. "What happened?" I told him plainly. He stared at me like I'd told him I'd committed a crime. "She's dealing with a lot right now," he said. "You know that. This isn't like you." That sentence, "this isn't like you," is the one I want you to sit with because I think it's the truest single line in this entire story about how families like mine operate. For 4 years, like me, had meant a woman who absorbed every request without complaint. The first time I set a boundary, after 4 years of near total availability, I wasn't seen as someone finally protecting her own life. I was seen as someone who had suddenly, inexplicably, become unreliable. The person who had been quietly exploited for years became, in a single Sunday phone call, the person accused of selfishness. If you've ever been the responsible one who finally said no, and watched the room reorganize itself around the idea that you were the problem, I don't have to explain what that felt like. You already know. That was the beginning of what I can only describe as an escalation, though at the time each individual moment still felt small enough to explain away, the same way each of Daniel's individual withdrawals had felt small enough to explain away 3 years earlier. Family dynamics, once disturbed, don't collapse all at once. They ripple. Within 2 weeks, I noticed that Daniel's sister-in-law, a woman I'd always gotten along with reasonably well, had stopped responding to texts with her usual warmth. Short, clipped replies where there used to be long ones. Within a month, I found out, secondhand, through Iris, who'd heard it from a cousin, that there was a version of events circulating through Daniel's extended family in which I had changed, had gotten cold, had stopped being there for the family the way I used to. Nobody in that version of the story asked why a woman who had spent 4 years available around the clock had suddenly, in one specific week, said no to one specific request. The story that spread wasn't curious. It was convenient. I want to be precise about something here. I don't believe most of these relatives were being cruel on purpose. I believe most of them were repeating a story that had been handed to them, a simpler and more comfortable story than the true one, because the true one implicated people they loved. It's always easier to believe the person who suddenly stopped giving is the villain than to ask what, exactly, they'd been giving up to that point and why. The financial pressure started not long after that. It was subtle at first. A joint credit card that Daniel had, unbeknownst to me, been running a modest balance on for Marcus's still struggling business, a balance that came due in a way that squeezed our shared budget right when I'd started, quietly, building my own separate savings on Patricia's advice. Then it escalated. Daniel began questioning purchases he'd never questioned before, small things, groceries, a dress I'd bought for a work event, framed as concern about our finances being tight, a framing that would have been almost funny if I hadn't known, by then, exactly how untight our actual combined finances were, once you accounted for the $230,000+ sitting quietly in Delaware. There was a family meeting, Carol's phrase for it, delivered over a Sunday dinner I'd been all but summoned to, where I sat across from Daniel, Carol, and Marcus, and listened to a coordinated, if not explicitly rehearsed, set of appeals about the importance of families sticking together, about how everyone goes through rough patches, about how Daniel had always been there for me. A claim so far from the documented truth sitting in a folder in Patricia's office that I nearly laughed out loud. I didn't. I sat there and let them talk, the same way I let a claimant talk during an interview when I already know their story doesn't hold together, because the version of events someone tells you when they think they still have the upper hand is always more useful than the version they tell you if they knew what you already had. Carol, at one point during that dinner, reached across the table and took my hand and said, with what I genuinely believe was sincere emotion, "You're my daughter too, you know. Whatever's going on between you and Daniel, this family doesn't want to lose you." I remember looking at her and thinking about the email. You can hold assets separately even while married, just don't put her name on anything new, and understanding with a kind of sad clarity that Carol meant that sentence and had also, 2 years earlier, helped her son build the exact architecture that would make losing me a matter of paperwork rather than heartbreak. People can hold two incompatible truths about themselves at once. I think Carol genuinely loved me. I also think she loved protecting her son's money more, and had simply never had to notice that those two loyalties were in conflict because I had never, until that Sunday phone call, made her choose. It was around this time, about 4 months after I'd found the folder, 2 months after I'd hired Patricia, that Daniel tried something I want to describe carefully because it was, of everything that happened, the moment that came closest to working. He suggested a trip. Not a grand gesture, not flowers or a speech. Daniel had never been that kind of man, and I think if he had suddenly become that kind of man, I would have been more suspicious, not less. He suggested, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, that we take a long weekend at the lake house his family had owned for decades, the same lake house where we'd spent our honeymoon, just the two of us, no phones, no Iris, no family obligations. "I think we need to remember who we were," he said, "before all of this. And I want to tell you, honestly, that some small, exhausted, still hopeful part of me wanted that to be real. 16 years is a long time to want a thing to be true." We drove up on a Friday afternoon in early autumn, the lake gone that particular flat silver color it turns before the leaves change, and for the first evening, it almost was what he'd promised. We cooked dinner together in the same small kitchen where we'd cooked our first dinner as a married couple. He told me a story about a client deal that had fallen apart in a way that was actually funny, the first funny thing he'd told me in over a year. For a few hours, I let myself remember what it had felt like to be inside something instead of investigating it from the outside. On Saturday morning, over coffee on the dock, he told me he wanted to reset everything, his phrase, and that he'd been thinking that maybe part of what had gone wrong between us was that our finances had gotten too complicated, too tangled, and that maybe the healthiest thing, as a fresh start, would be for us to simplify. He wanted, he said, to talk to a financial advisor together about restructuring, how our assets were held, cleaner lines, he called it, so we're not stepping on each other. I asked him, as evenly as I could manage, what exactly he meant by restructuring. And he told me, in careful, reasonable language, that he thought it might make sense for the duplex, the one he'd already quietly moved into the LLC 18 months earlier, though of course he didn't say that, to be formally his, in exchange for a larger share of our joint retirement accounts coming to me. A clean trade, he called it. Fair, even generous, framed entirely as an act of care. It took everything I had, sitting on that dock, not to tell him what I already knew. "I understand," Now, that this was the reconciliation with a price that I think Patricia had warned me to watch for without ever using those exact words. The offer wrapped around a demand, the fresh start that required me, one more time, to sign something. If I hadn't already spent 4 months building a file, if I hadn't already sat across from a divorce attorney I'd hired without his knowledge, I think that doc conversation might have worked. I think old me, the me who extended endless good faith, might have said yes, might have signed whatever he put in front of me, grateful just to have him looking at me like I mattered again. I didn't say yes. I told him I needed to think about it, which was true in the sense that I needed to go back and confirm every fact I already suspected, and false in every sense that mattered to him. We drove home on Sunday in a silence that felt, for the first time in years, honest. Not the flat silence of two people with nothing to say, but the taut silence of two people who both, I think on some level, knew that something had just been tested and had failed. 2 days later, I called Patricia and told her about the lake house conversation. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "That confirms something we needed confirmed. He's aware the arrangement is vulnerable, or he wouldn't be trying to formalize it while things still look amicable."
She paused.
I think it's time. If you've ever been offered exactly the apology you'd been waiting years for, and felt yourself hesitate anyway because some quiet, hard-won part of you had learned to check the math before you believed the words, you understand exactly where I was standing on that dock. We filed 3 weeks later. I want to walk you through what that actually looked like because I think the phrase "we filed" makes it sound simpler and more instantaneous than it was. Patricia and I had spent those 3 weeks compiling everything. The LLC documents, the bank statement cross-references, the quitclaim deed Daniel had gotten me to sign without full disclosure, Carol's email, the retainer letter from 8 months prior, a full forensic timeline that laid out, in dates and dollar amounts, exactly how and when the marital assets had been diverted. When Patricia filed for divorce on my behalf and simultaneously filed a motion asking the court to freeze the Meridian Point account pending a full accounting, she attached that entire timeline as an exhibit. Daniel found out he was being served on a Thursday at his office and called me 40 minutes later in a state I had genuinely never heard from him before. Not angry, not defensive, but something closer to disbelief, as though the woman he'd spent 3 years quietly maneuvering around had simply materialized as a legal adversary out of nowhere, without any warning at all. "You went behind my back," he said, and I remember standing in our kitchen, my kitchen, I was already starting to think of it that way, and feeling something in me go very still and very clear. "I found the folder 11 months before you told me you wanted a fresh start," I told him. "I've had a lawyer for the last 4 of them. I didn't go behind your back, Daniel. I went behind the same curtain you'd already built." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he said quietly, "How long have you known?" "Long enough," I said, "to stop waiting for you to tell me the truth." The counterattack that followed, once Daniel and Carol understood the situation had genuinely turned, was more coordinated than anything that had come before, and I think it's worth walking through, because I suspect it will sound familiar to anyone who has ever tried to hold a family member accountable and discovered that accountability is rarely welcomed with grace. Daniel's attorney, the one from the retainer I'd found in that folder, attempted to argue that the Meridian Point account represented premarital funds and separate business earnings, a claim that fell apart within the first round of discovery once Patricia's forensic accountant traced 11 distinct deposits directly back to withdrawals from our joint household account, dates and amounts matching almost to the penny, the same paper trail I'd found on that gray office carpet nearly a year earlier. Carol, for her part, called me twice in the space of 1 week, the first call an attempt at guilt. "You're tearing this family apart over money," and the second, when the guilt didn't land, a version of religious appeal, invoking the vows I'd made under that maple tree in her backyard 17 years before, as though a promise made at 28 bound a person to remain in an arrangement built on concealment at 44. Marcus, who owed me, now legally, a portion of the money he'd borrowed years earlier, sent a single text message that I still have saved that read, "You know none of this would have happened if you'd just been more patient with the family." I didn't respond. There wasn't a version of a response that would have reached whatever was actually being protected in that sentence. There was one attempt, about 2 months into the proceedings, at what Patricia called fake mediation, a family gathering, organized by Carol under the guise of just wanting everyone in a room to talk like adults. That turned out, once I arrived, to be an ambush of sorts. Daniel, Carol, Marcus, and Marcus's wife, all present, all prepared with some version of the same argument, that I was being vindictive, that a fair settlement without lawyers would be better for everyone, especially Iris. I stayed for 11 minutes. I stood up, thanked them for their concern about my daughter, and told them that Iris's stability was precisely why I wasn't willing to base a financial settlement on trust, given what trust had already cost me. Then I left. I think that room believed, right up until I stood up, that I would fold. I think a version of me from 3 years earlier might have. But I had spent 19 years learning what a case looks like once the paper trail is airtight, and I knew, by that point, standing in Carol's living room, that the facts were no longer a matter of opinion. They were documented. And documentation, unlike affection, unlike guilt, unlike the memory of a maple tree, doesn't change its mind under pressure. The most important conversation in all of this, the one I want to end on before I tell you where things stand now, happened not with Daniel and not with Carol, but with Iris about 6 weeks after the filing. On a night, she came into the kitchen while I was doing exactly what I'd been doing for years, standing at the counter with a spreadsheet open on my laptop, going line by line through something that needed tracking. "Is that the divorce stuff?" she asked. She was 17 by then, sharp in the particular way teenagers are sharp when they've spent a year quietly watching adults fail to tell them the truth. I told her it was, and I told her, more than I'd told her up to that point, roughly what had happened. Not every detail, but enough. The account. The house. The 3 years I hadn't known about. She listened without interrupting, the way she did when she was actually absorbing something instead of just waiting to talk. And when I finished, she said something that I think about more than almost anything else that happened during that entire period. "I always thought you were the calm one because you didn't feel things as much as Dad," she said. "I didn't know you were the calm one because you were the only one actually paying attention." I didn't cry in front of the lawyer. I didn't cry in front of Carol, or Daniel, or in that ambush of a family meeting. I cried, quietly, standing in my own kitchen, in front of my daughter, because she was the first person in that entire ordeal who had looked at my composure and seen it correctly, not as coldness, not as the absence of love, but as the exact discipline it had actually cost me to hold a family together while slowly discovering that one of its members had already, secretly, decided to leave. The settlement, when it finally came, 6 months after filing, wasn't the outcome of a courtroom battle in the dramatic sense. Patricia had been right that the paper trail would do most of the work. Daniel's attorney, faced with a forensic timeline and a judge who did not look kindly on the pattern of concealment, negotiated instead of fighting to trial. I received half the value of the Meridian Point account, the full duplex reinstated as marital property with my interest restored, and a settlement structure that Patricia described, with something close to satisfaction, as about as clean a result as this kind of case gets. But I want to tell you honestly that the number on that settlement, while it mattered, while it meant I could keep our house, could fund Iris's college fund without panic, could rebuild a version of financial security that had quietly been taken from me one small transfer at a time, was never actually the thing I was fighting for. The money was the proof. It was never the point. The point, the thing I actually walked away from that year understanding, was the belief I'd carried for most of my adult life. That if I just kept showing up, kept being useful, kept absorbing every request and softening every edge, love would eventually come back on its own. The way heat returns to a banked fire if you just leave it long enough. I understand now that this belief wasn't wrong because love doesn't sometimes cool and warm again. It does in marriages that are actually still built on honesty. It was wrong because I had let it excuse me from ever asking the one question that might have protected me years earlier. Not, is he happy? Not, are we okay? But, is he still telling me the truth? Daniel and I finalized the divorce 14 months after that Thursday afternoon in the lawyer's office. And I want to tell you what happened after, because I think the ending of a story like this matters less for what it proves about the person who left than for what it reveals about the person who stayed standing. I still have the watch. I should tell you about the watch, because I mentioned early on that there were objects in this story that carried more weight than they seemed to, and I've been circling around this one the whole time. Daniel gave it to me on our 5th anniversary. A plain gold watch with a second hand that ticked instead of swept, the kind of gift that felt, at the time, like a promise about permanence, something built to last, something that would keep working long after flashier things had failed. It stopped running about 2 years ago. I never had it fixed. I told myself for a long time that I just hadn't gotten around to it, the same way I told myself a lot of things during those years. After the settlement, going through a box of things I was finally ready to sort, I found it again, still stopped at 447, wherever it had been the moment its battery gave out. I took it to a jeweler downtown, not because I wanted to wear it again, but because I wanted, I think, to know whether something that had gone quiet for that long could still be brought back to accurate time. It could. It ticks now on my dresser, not on my wrist, keeping perfect time in a house it no longer has any claim on being permanent in. I look at it most mornings. It reminds me less of Daniel now than of the version of myself who spent years assuming that stillness meant safety, who didn't understand that some silences are peaceful and some are simply a clock winding down without you noticing. I kept my job, obviously. It's the thing that gave me the exact skill set I needed to survive this, and I've thought more than once about the strange justice of that the career I built to catch other people's deceptions turned out to be the only reason I ever caught my own husband's. Iris is at Ohio State now, studying, of all things, forensic accounting, a choice she made after watching, at 17, exactly what a spreadsheet and a paper trail could do in the hands of someone who refused to look away. I'd be lying if I said that didn't undo me a little, in the best possible way, every time I think about it. Carol and I speak occasionally, briefly, at Iris's request, a careful détente neither of us has tried to turn into more than it is. I don't hate her. I think, honestly, that Carol is a woman who loved her son more completely than she ever managed to interrogate what that love was asking her to help him do, and I think there's a version of me from a decade ago who might have made the exact same mistake for someone I loved. I don't excuse it. I understand it. Those are different things, and learning the difference between them is, I think, one of the quieter gifts this whole ordeal gave me. If you've ever been the one everyone assumed would keep showing up, the dependable one, the calm one, the one who could be counted on to absorb whatever the family needed absorbed, I hope you hear this part clearly. Being trustworthy is not the same as being safe. You can build an entire life on being the person who never asks for too much, and still end up the last one in the room to find out what everyone else already knew. I spent 16 years believing that my steadiness was the glue holding a marriage together. It turned out to be, for at least the last 3 of those years, the exact cover Daniel needed to build his exit without ever having to have an honest conversation with me at all. I don't know how to end a story like this the way people expect. I'm not going to tell you that family isn't everything because that's too easy, and it isn't even quite true. Family was everything for a long time, and I don't regret a single one of those years of showing up, of driving Carol to her appointments, of believing in the maple tree and the toast, and the version of Daniel who told bad jokes about federal disclosure requirements in a beige conference room half a lifetime ago. What I regret, if I regret anything, is how long it took me to turn the same clear, unflinching attention I gave to strangers' claims files toward my own life. I regret extending a courtesy to my own marriage that I would never have extended to a case on my desk, the assumption that because someone is familiar, they must also be honest. I don't extend that courtesy blindly anymore. Not to anyone. It's cost me a little of the easy trust one used to move through the world with, and I think that's a fair trade for what it's given me instead, which is the simple, hard-won ability to notice, in time, when the person across the table from me has already made a decision they haven't told me about. If any part of this sounds like your own life, if you've ever been the one who kept the peace and slowly disappeared into it, I hope you'll tell me in the comments, because I think there are more of us than any of us realize, and I think the first step out of that particular quiet is realizing you're not the only one standing in the room, still keeping the lights on long after everyone else has already found the door.